This evening, we are memorializing Steve Biko. Steve Biko offered us a politics of blackness that released it from the constraints of inferiority and let us know that Black people could collectively embody humanity and the foundational impulse toward freedom. Blackness was to be reimagined and reconstructed in the very process of collective struggle. As Mandela said of Steve Biko living, he was the spark that lit a wildfire across South Africa. His message to the youth and students was simple and clear. Black is beautiful. Be proud of your blackness. And with that, Mandela continues, he inspired our youth to shed themselves of the sense of inferiority they were born into as a result of more than 300 years of white rule. Black was not only proclaimed to be beautiful, Black would become the sign of a trajectory toward human emancipation. In Biko's own words, it becomes more necessary to see the truth as it is if you realize that the only vehicle for change are those who have lost their personality. The first step is to make the Black man come to himself, to pump life into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity, to remind him of his complicity in the crime of allowing himself to be misused and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of his birth. This was a stirring, powerful statement. But I must also point out here that the political discourse of the time had the effect of foreclosing the participation and the acknowledged conscientization of those who did not fall under the sign of the male gender. And as we know, some of the most passionate activists in the student movement of that period were women. And we know that the first major protests, so to speak, the mother of all protests, had been the Women's March to Pretoria on August 9th, 1956. And so I have kept in my mind the image of that monumental gathering. Lillian Ngoyi, Helen Joseph, Albertina Sisulu, Fatima Mayer, Florence Mofoso, Ruth Mompati, Sophie Williams-De Breen, and all of the 20,000 women staging a silent protest here in Pretoria in front of union buildings. Now you have touched the women. You have struck a rock. You have dislodged a boulder. You will be crushed. Women have always been at the heart of anti-racist and progressive activism. We thus have to give ourselves permission to honor the women activists as we celebrate the legacies of the men who have come to represent the struggles of the past. And those men who most deserve to be celebrated, men like W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X in the United States. In South Africa, men like Nelson Mandela, Chris Hani, and of course, Steve Biko. As influenced as they may have all been by ideologies of patriarchy, of heteropatriarchy, their work helped to create a discursive arena for the development of Black feminist consciousness. They were also aware that their leadership was precisely enabled by those with whom they struggled, and not only the men, but the women as well. We are thankful, profoundly thankful for these legacies, but we do not receive them uncritically. Our understandings of the past are very much determined by our positions in the present and by how we imagine the future. From the perspective of the present, we can apprehend what was hidden behind the restrictive discourses of the past. Steve Biko died so that we would be able to develop these perspectives today. And we understand today some of the silences, some of the erasures, some of the foreclosures of those past struggles. We have also learned important lessons from the arrests Biko endured, from his imprisonment, from the torture, and from the long struggle to reveal the true circumstances of his death. Biko organized students. Students have always been at the forefront of radical change. An essential dimension of the learning process is critical thinking, learning how to question things as they are, learning how to imagine the possibility of something different is the very essence of education. Facts are easily attainable, especially today. People who have access to the internet have access to infinite libraries of factual information. But what do we do with that information? Steve Biko and his comrades led vast numbers of students to raise questions about apartheid and to imagine a different world, even as they clashed with the world as it was. Knowledge is useless unless it assists us to question habits, social practices, institutions, ideologies, the state. This questioning cannot end, even when victories are won. Even when victories are won. Students are now recognizing that the legacies of past struggles are not static. If these legacies mean anything at all, they are mandates to develop new strategies, new technologies of struggle. And these legacies, when they are taken up by new generations, reveal unfulfilled promises of the past, and therefore give rise to new activisms. As an activist of Steve Biko's generation, I have to constantly remind myself that the struggles of our contemporary times should be thought of as productive contradictions, because they constitute a rupture with past struggles, but at the same time they reside on a continuum with those struggles, and they have been enabled by activisms of the past. They are unfinished activisms. Activisms enabled by the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, which was at its core a women's boycott. It was a women's boycott. By the August 9th Women's March 60 years ago, by the founding of the Black Panther Party 50 years ago, rather, almost exactly 50 years ago. It will be 50 years in October. By the uprising in Soweto 40 years ago, by the struggles undertaken by Biko and his comrades to create the South African Students' Organization, by the struggles of Nelson Mandela and the heroic members of the ANC, by Mkhonto Wesiswe. This is the genealogy young activists share across oceans. The young activists of today stand on our shoulders. And precisely because they stand on our shoulders, they see something of what we have seen, but they also see and understand a great deal more. They are beginning to address unresolved questions and some of the erasures and foreclosures about which I spoke earlier. They stand on our shoulders, but we do not provide a steady foundation. Precisely because our questions were questions of a different era. Our critiques were expressed in the inadequate discourses of the past. And the young activists want to reveal the erasures. They want to question what we did not have the full capacity to question in our time. Therefore, they sway, they teeter-totter, they falter, they make terrible mistakes, just as we did at their age. When we stood on the shoulders of those who came before us, but just as we learn from our mistakes, they must be allowed to learn from theirs. They must be allowed to learn from theirs, even when it appears that they are simply repeating our mistakes. One of the truly exciting dimensions about the activisms, both here in South Africa and in the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, is that they're being led by women. I had the honor of meeting Nopindulo Mikachwa, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Who is the current president of the Student Representative Council at WITS, and Shaira Kala, who is the past president. And under their leadership, the contestation of the fee hikes, fees must fall, began to resonate across the country and around the world. There's some who've said that the student demands are unrealistic, especially when students begin to call for free education. But the demand for free education is only realistic because we continue to live with the mandates of capitalism. And we are compelled to think about education as a commodity. And especially in the aftermath of the global Occupy movement, the thoroughgoing commodification of education under the dictates of capital is increasingly viewed by progressive activists as an obscenity. This is not the way things should be. Freedom should mean, in the very first place, the freedom of education, the freedom to learn. And the prerequisite for enjoying freedom of education should not be the capacity to pay. It should not be the capacity to pay. If students are calling for free education, they are reminding us how retrograde our social priorities have become. The demand for free education reminds us of the world we should be inhabiting. It reminds us of the legacies that have produced impulses toward the future. When they move from no-fee heights to free education, they remind us of the revolution we need to be fighting today. The three young women in the U.S. who first produced the hashtag Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who first produced the hashtag Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of the vigilante racist killing of Trayvon Martin. And then went on to create the network Black Lives Matter. As the Ferguson protest erupted 2 years ago, these young women are collectively striving to remind us of the revolution we need as they try to develop strategies for struggle today. There has been an uneasy relationship with the veterans of the movement that came before them. The uneasiness emanates from the fact that veterans often take themselves and their knowledges too seriously. Sometimes we assume that our questions and the tentative answers we provided to those questions deserve to be accorded a permanence that silences future questions and answers. Sometimes we look for leadership in the familiar guise, the charismatic male leader who in the U.S. historically has emerged from church communities or religious circles. And when we cannot find that form of leadership, we say their movement has no leaders. But they answer back, our movement is full of leaders. We are not a leaderless movement, we are a leader-full movement. And the Black Lives Matter movement seeks to build new forms of leadership, feminist leadership. Leadership, whether of women or men, queer, trans, or straight. Leadership that is collective, inclusive, and democratic. And so perhaps we now need the leadership of those who have been historically barred from leadership positions, those who have been silenced. Perhaps we need leadership that will assist us to develop new vocabularies that encourage inclusiveness and interconnectedness, vocabularies that recognize interdependencies, intersectionalities, and internationalisms of our struggle. In other words, vocabularies that highlight the feminist dimensions of all of our social justice struggles. We have learned how our languages and our institutions, including our prisons, participate in the reproduction of ideologies of gender that violently exclude those who cannot find themselves within binary gender structures. Trans women of color have brought new analyses of our institutions, especially institutions of punishment, which have deepened our understanding of the importance of abolitionist approaches. Prison abolition which calls for the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, and the abolition of policing as we know it, must also involve the abolition of racism and the abolition of gender policing and a constant critique of heteropatriarchy. We have learned about the symbiotic interconnectedness of state violence and intimate violence. We now perceive an economy of violence in which the symbiotic relationship of different modes of violence, state violence, institutional violence, intimate violence, thrives on excess violence directed at certain communities, for example, trans communities of color. Revealing these reservoirs of violence and openly challenging them helps to diminish the overall economy of gender violence. The message of the Black Lives Movement is that Black lives are not abstract and fungible lives that can be subject to repression under the sign of the universal equality of human beings. The Black Lives Movement challenges what we might call the tyranny of the universal. And I say that there's something very important and very powerful that Black lives offer. Histories and temporalities and languages and aesthetics and possibilities of freedom. Possibilities of freedom. This tyranny of the universal was first challenged, I believe, in political, social action by the Haitian Revolution. If we examine struggles against slavery everywhere, we know that in every important movement there were resonances of the Haitian Revolution. The insistence by women and men who came to call themselves Haitian that to be human is to collectively struggle to be free. There is no such thing as freedom for a single individual. We know that freedom, as it has been conceived under bourgeois democracies, has always been a limited freedom, a freedom accorded to racial, class, and gender elites, a freedom that acquires its value precisely because of its powers of exclusion.